She appeared at the edge of the firelit gathering dressed in white, a figure so striking that even the drums seemed to falter for a heartbeat. The native feast, sacred and steeped in tradition, was a place where outsiders had never been welcomed. Yet there she stood, her dress catching the glow of the flames, her steps steady against the weight of countless watching eyes. For a moment, silence swept across the circle. No one moved, no one breathed. It was as if history itself had paused to see what would unfold. The farmer's daughter had been warned. A woman dressed in white among the tribe was a vision heavy with meaning, a symbol often tied to promises, unions, and change. She knew that her presence was not just defiance. It was a statement, a declaration that she would not be bound by the lines drawn between her world and theirs. She walked not with arrogance, but with resolve, her heart pounding, her spirit braced against the storm she knew her choice would ignite. Whispers rippled like wind through tall grass. Some saw her as an intruder, an insult draped in pale cloth. Others saw courage, a willingness to stand against centuries of division. Among the younger ones, awe flickered in their eyes, for they had grown weary of old stories of hatred and feared destinies carved by bitterness. Her white dress, once a target of ridicule in her town, now shone like a beacon in the dark, daring to suggest that unity was possible in a land carved by prejudice. The chief himself rose to his feet, his weathered face unreadable in the firelight. His people waited for the command. Would he send her away, cast her back across the border, or allow the feast to be scarred by her presence? The woman stood tall beneath his gaze, not begging, not trembling. Her silence carried its own power, a challenge hidden within humility. And as the chief studied her, the weight of generations pressed heavily on his shoulders. By dawn, the borderlands were in uproar. The news had spread with the speed of wildfire. A woman in white had crossed the line no one dared to cross, and the feast had not ended in blood. The land itself seemed to hum with uncertainty, the air alive with questions that no one could ignore. Had she broken a sacred law, or had she planted the seed of something the West had never seen before? One thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. The uproar spread, not only along the border, but deep into the hearts of both communities. In the town, whispers turned to arguments as neighbors gathered in the saloon, each voice louder than the last. Some called the woman reckless, accusing her of courting danger by daring to wear white at a feast meant only for the tribe. Others spoke in hushed awe, saying her courage had opened a door that had long been locked. Her father, the poor farmer, remained silent. Though his heart pounded with fear for her safety, there was also pride swelling quietly within him. He knew that sometimes history was changed not by men with guns, but by women who walked in a fire without flinching. Across the border, the tribe wrestled with its own unrest. Warriors fumed at what they saw as an insult to their traditions, while elders debated the meaning of her appearance. The white dress, in their memory, was a garment reserved for transformation, a sign of new bonds and the breaking of old cycles. Some believed her presence was a prophecy fulfilled, while others feared it was a sign of betrayal. But beneath the tension, a current of curiosity stirred. What if her act was not defiance, but destiny? The young, both in the town and the tribe, felt the spark most keenly. To them, she was not a trespasser, but a symbol of hope. They had grown weary of carrying grudges that were not theirs, tired of listening to stories of hatred they had never chosen. To see her cross into the feast and stand unbroken beneath the chief's gaze made their hearts beat faster. It was a reminder that boundaries, no matter how old, were not unshakable. The woman herself bore the weight of these storms in silence. She did not speak of rebellion or of peace, for words could easily be twisted. Instead, she allowed her actions to speak for her. She stood among the tribe, ate from their fire, listened to their songs, and carried herself with a dignity that asked for no apology. In every movement, she embodied not arrogance, but courage, the kind that demands respect even when none is offered freely. By the second day, both town and tribe were no longer asking what had happened, but what it meant. And in that question lay the beginning of change. For when people stop declaring what must always be and start asking what could be, the future itself begins to shift. The chief could not ignore the weight of the moment. In council, he sat among his elders, their voices rising and falling like restless winds. Some demanded that she be cast out immediately, warning that her presence was a crack in the foundation of their heritage. Others urged caution, reminding him that dismissing her could turn her into a martyr for unity, and perhaps even fulfill a prophecy none of them wanted to admit might be true. The chief's silence was heavy, but in his heart he knew that her courage had already changed more than words could undo. In the town, leaders gathered in their own meeting, fueled by fear and pride. They spoke of honor, of insult, of the danger of allowing one woman's act to rewrite the boundaries they had enforced for generations. Yet even as they cursed her name, their voices trembled, because they knew the truth. Her crossing had not ended in violence. And that single fact gnawed at the foundation of their arguments. Meanwhile, the people themselves, ordinary men and women, children and elders, spoke differently. Around fires and tables, they repeated the story not with anger, but with fascination. They described how she had stood unflinching, how the firelight had made her dress glow like something more than cloth, how the drums had faltered for her steps. To many, she was no longer simply the farmer's daughter. She had become a figure of legend, alive and breathing before their very eyes. The woman carried none of these titles in her own heart. She returned to her father's farm quietly, tending to chores as though nothing had changed. Yet at night, she could still feel the weight of the firelight on her white dress, could still hear the silence that had swallowed the feast at her arrival. She knew she had stepped into a current far greater than herself, one that would pull town and tribe alike toward a destiny neither could avoid. By the week's end, both borders and hearts were restless. Old prejudices had not disappeared, but they had been shaken. Fear clashed with fascination. Suspicion battled against hope. And in that fragile tension, a seed had been planted, one that could either wither under hatred or bloom into a future that the West itself had never dared to imagine. As days turned into weeks, the echoes of her act grew louder than the event itself. In the taverns of the town, cowboys argued heatedly over mugs of whiskey. Some spat curses, calling her a fool who had insulted both her people and the tribe. Others defended her, insisting she had done what none of them dared, walked into the fire of centuries-old hatred and come out unburned. The more they argued, the clearer it became. Her silence at the feast had spoken louder than any speech they could give. Within the tribe, elders recounted the moment with a mix of unease and wonder. They spoke of her dress, how it gleamed white against the night, as though untouched by the dust of the earth. They debated whether it was an omen of union or disaster. Some swore the ancestors had whispered through the flames, warning them that the time of division was ending. Yet others clung to fear, saying no outsider could carry purity into a sacred circle. Their voices clashed, but their certainty had been broken. And once certainty breaks, nothing can ever truly return to the way it was. The woman herself remained steady. She wore no pride, carried no banner of rebellion, and claimed no title. She simply lived her life with the quiet rhythm of the farm, her hands in the soil, her gaze on the horizon. Yet everywhere she walked, eyes followed her. Children whispered her name with awe. Young men and women from both sides stole glances filled with hope, and even the hardened elders could not look upon her without remembering the night the drums had faltered. The chief, however, carried the heaviest burden. His daughter's courage had forced his people to confront truths buried under layers of bitterness. He knew that if he condemned her, he would only prove the weakness of fear. Yet if he embraced her act, he risked unraveling traditions that had defined his people for generations. The weight of the decision pressed on him like a stone, but in the silence of his thoughts, he could not shake the image of her standing unbroken in white. It was not defiance he had seen in her. It was destiny. And so, tension rippled across the borderlands like heat shimmering in the desert sun. Both communities stood at a threshold, caught between the comfort of the past and the promise of something new. No one could yet name it, but deep down they all felt the truth. One act of courage had begun to dismantle centuries of walls, and the West itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would rise in their place. The turning point arrived with the harvest season. The fields on the town side had withered under drought, while the tribe's hunters had returned with little to show from the forests. Hunger does not care for boundaries, and, for the first time, both communities faced the same gnawing emptiness. Fear threatened to reignite old hatred. Townsfolk muttered that the tribe would raid their stores, and warriors warned that the town would seize what little they had. But before suspicion could become violence, the woman stepped forward once again. She gathered what little grain her family had saved and carried it across the border at dawn. The townsfolk watched in silence, astonished, as she walked with the same steadiness she had shown at the feast. At the edge of the tribe's camp, she laid the sacks upon the ground, not as charity, but as a gesture of trust. Then she turned and walked away, leaving her offering in the open for all to see. Her act demanded no thanks, it demanded reflection. The tribe's elders stood in debate once more, torn between pride and necessity. But the chief silenced them with a single gesture. He ordered that the grain be divided not only among his people, but shared back with the town as well. In that moment, both sides tasted the truth that had long been buried. Survival was not the prize of one alone, but the gift of both together. Her offering had done what hunger and fear could not. It forced them to see themselves not as enemies, but as neighbors. Word spread quickly, carried by the voices of children who ran between fields and fires. They told of the woman in white who had fed the starving, of the chief who had returned her gift with honor, of a day when both sides ate from the same grain. It became more than an event. It became a story, one that grew each time it was told, binding itself into the fabric of the people's memory. And as night fell, the fires of the town and the tribe burned with a new light. They were still divided by distance, still separated by scars, but something had shifted irreversibly. The border that had once been a wall now trembled like an old rope ready to break. And everyone who gazed across the darkness knew that the West was changing, not with the thunder of war, but with the quiet defiance of a woman who dared to wear white. The nights that followed were restless, filled with both hope and unease. Around campfires, the elders of the tribe spoke of the farmer's daughter in tones that mingled reverence with fear. They wondered aloud whether her presence and her offerings marked the beginning of a prophecy foretold by their ancestors, a time when the walls of hatred would crumble and unity would rise in its place. Some resisted, unwilling to release the grip of old wounds, but the younger warriors listened with quiet eyes that betrayed curiosity rather than disdain. In the town, merchants and farmers argued heatedly in the square. Some insisted that her actions would bring ruin, claiming she had weakened the town by giving away their grain. Others, however, could not ignore the strange shift in the air. They pointed to the chief's response, how the tribe had returned her offering with fairness, and how for the first time in memory, no blood had been spilled at the border. Whispers began to replace shouts, and reflections started to edge out pride. The woman herself remained silent, her life as steady as the soil she worked. Yet her presence had become more than her own. Each time she walked through the market, townsfolk turned to look. Each time she crossed paths with tribal children, they ran to her without hesitation. She had become a living bridge, one that neither side had asked for, yet both now relied upon. Her white dress, carefully folded away, had become a symbol far greater than fabric. It was a memory that carried meaning into every conversation. The chief, observing quietly, felt the tug of history in his chest. His daughter had not shattered his people's dignity. She had revealed its strength. By meeting compassion with compassion, they had proven that honor did not have to be guarded by blades. Still, he knew the dangers. Prejudice, though shaken, was not dead. He feared that envy or pride would strike back, eager to destroy what had barely begun to bloom. And yet, in his heart, he also knew that destiny often demands risk. So the chief summoned both his elders and the town's leaders to the border, calling for a gathering unlike any seen before. It was a meeting not to exchange threats, but to share words. The people came with suspicion, but also with curiosity, their hearts unsettled by the change already in motion. And when they stood face to face, divided by only a few feet of earth, all eyes turned not to the chief nor the elders, but to the woman who had dared to cross the line in white. The border meeting began beneath a sky painted red by the setting sun. The chief stood with the weight of his people's history on his shoulders, while the town elders carried the heavy pride of their own. At first, words were stiff and careful, as though every sentence was a step across thin ice. The past was too close, the wounds too raw. Yet the silence that followed each exchange carried the memory of what had already been done. The feast, the offering, the returned grain. These were not illusions. They were facts carved into memory, undeniable even to the hardest hearts. When the woman stepped forward, the crowd stirred. She did not speak of peace in grand terms, nor did she preach of unity with lofty promises. Instead, she told a simple truth, that hunger had been eased when both sides chose to share, that no lies had been lost when courage replaced suspicion, that her steps into the feast had not ended in chaos but in possibility. Her words were not long, but they carried the quiet power of lived truth, and that truth struck deeper than any argument. The elders of the town exchanged uneasy glances. They had built their reputations on guarding the border, on feeding fear to maintain control. But now, before their eyes, they saw their own people listening not to them but to her. The same was true among the tribe's council. Warriors who had once sworn never to yield now shifted in place, their eyes fixed on the farmer's daughter, as though she carried the wisdom of both peoples. In that fragile moment, authority began to slip from pride and settle into the hands of compassion. The chief spoke then, his voice steady as stone. He acknowledged the centuries of division, the blood that had been spilled, the distrust carried like chains. But he also admitted what few had dared, that those chains had not protected them. They had bound them. He declared that the time had come to choose whether to remain prisoners of the past or builders of a future. His words echoed across the gathering like a challenge carved into the very soil. And as the sun sank fully into the horizon, torches flickering in the dusk, the people realized that they were no longer debating an act of defiance. They were standing at the edge of turning point, one that would either harden the border into iron or dissolve it into dust. And in their silence, a question rose louder than any voice. Would they dare to follow the woman in white into a new dawn? The crowd stood suspended between silence and decision. The torches burned low, crackling against the wind, casting shadows that seemed to dance between the faces of the two peoples. Some looked uncertain, others defiant, but many more carried the same quiet wonder that had spread since the night of the feast. For the first time in generations, they were not shouting across the border. They were listening together. It was as if the land itself was waiting, holding its breath to see whether history would finally break its chains. A young warrior stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the farmer's daughter. He was known for his fiery spirit, for his mistrust of outsiders, yet his voice trembled as he spoke. He confessed that when he first saw her in white, he had wanted to cast her out with his own hands. But now, after witnessing her courage and the chief's wisdom, he admitted he could no longer see her as an enemy. His words sent murmurs through the crowd, for they came not from an elder, but from the very heart of those who had been most resistant to change. On the town side, a merchant's wife raised her voice. She recalled how she had once mocked the farmer's daughter for her stubbornness, calling her foolish for dreaming of peace. Yet when hunger had struck and grain was shared, it was the daughter's act of giving that had fed her children. Her confession, raw and unadorned, struck the townsfolk like a hammer. They remembered their own shame, their own silent gratitude, and they felt their hearts pulled toward truth. The woman in white listened, her gaze steady but humble. She did not smile at their confessions, nor lower her head in pride. She simply stood as she had on the night of the feast, silent, resolute, and unafraid. Her presence reminded them that change does not demand perfection, only courage. And in her silence, they felt both their guilt and their hope reflected back to them, forcing them to confront what they had long denied. The border was no longer made of earth, but of choice. By the time the torches burned down to embers, a strange unity had formed, not in law, not in treaties, but in spirit. Both sides had spoken, both sides had confessed, and both sides had listened. The walls of prejudice, though not yet fallen, had begun to crack so deeply that no one could ignore it. And in those cracks, the first light of a new dawn had begun to shine. The days after the gathering felt different, as though time itself had shifted. Where once there had been hesitation, Now there was cautious cooperation. The tribe's hunters brought venison to the town square, and townsfolk shared flour and salt in return. What had been an uproar was now becoming a rhythm, awkward at first, but steady, like the first steps of a child learning to walk. And at the center of it all was the memory of the woman in white, her courage still echoing in every exchange. The poor farmer, her father, watched with quiet pride. He had long endured the scorn of his neighbors, their laughter at his poverty, their pity for his simple ways. But now, he saw those same neighbors looking at his daughter with reverence. They no longer whispered insults. They spoke her name as if it carried a weight greater than wealth. For him, it was not pride alone, but vindication, that humility and dignity could outlast even the harshest prejudice. The chief, too, carried himself differently. Though he still bore the scars of old battles, he walked into the town square with less suspicion, his steps slower, but more certain. He did not come as a conqueror, nor as a guest, but as an equal. His presence alongside townsfolk proved to all that the past could be acknowledged without being repeated. And when he spoke of the future, people leaned in, eager to hear rather than resist. Children were the first to erase the border completely. They ran freely from one side to the other, carrying laughter instead of fear. They traded games, shared stories, and built friendships that ignored the weight of history. Parents who once scolded them for crossing now watched quietly, realizing that their children had understood a truth greater than themselves, that unity is not taught by command, but by innocence. Yet beneath the fragile harmony, old voices of resistance still lingered. A handful of elders from both sides muttered that this peace was temporary, that sooner or later betrayal would return. They clung to their fears like armor, unwilling to let go. But their words sounded weaker than before, drowned by the sound of children's laughter and the memory of a woman who had dared to wear white to a feast where she was never meant to belong. The future was no longer theirs to hold back. Seasons passed, and with them the memory of the night in white grew into legend. At every feast, whether in the town square or in the tribal camp, her name was spoken with reverence. What had once been a scandal was now remembered as the turning point when division began to dissolve. Songs were sung about the courage of a woman who had crossed in a forbidden firelight, and children whispered stories of how her dress glowed against the flames. She was no longer just the farmer's daughter. She had become a symbol etched into the heart of the West. The bond between town and tribe deepened in ways no one could have predicted. They traded not only food, but knowledge, tools exchanged for healing herbs, seeds for hunting skills, language for song. In time, mixed gatherings became common, and fires burned with both peoples seated in the same circle. Where once borders had been guarded with suspicion, they were now paths trodden by neighbors. What began as tentative trust had grown into something that could no longer be ignored, a shared identity. The woman, however, never sought to be honored. She continued her work on the farm, her hands in the earth, her spirit as steady as the seasons. When asked of her courage, she dismissed it, saying she had only done what her heart demanded. Yet her humility made the people revere her all the more, for she reminded them that greatness often comes not from those who seek it, but from those who simply refuse to let fear decide their steps. Her father, once scorned for his poverty, found himself walking through town with new respect. Neighbors who had mocked him now greeted him with nods of acknowledgement. Though his farm remained modest, it became a place of gathering, a space where both town and tribe felt welcome. The very soil that had once been the symbol of his shame had become the ground where unity took root. His pride was not in wealth, but in the legacy his daughter had built with nothing but courage. Yet even as peace blossomed, there were shadows that lingered. A few hardened hearts remained unconvinced, whispering that unity was fragile, that history could not be erased so easily. But their voices grew fainter with each harvest, drowned out by the laughter of children who no longer cared about old divisions, and by the memory of a night when a woman's white dress had defied centuries of hate. Years later, when the farmer's daughter grew older, she would still walk the borderlands, her steps steady as they had been on the night of the feast. Children from both sides followed her, asking her to tell the story once more. She never embellished it, never sought to make herself larger than she was. She spoke simply of courage, of choice, and of the belief that fear should never decide the course of a life. And as the children listened, they carried her lesson forward into a future their parents had once thought impossible. The tribe honored her as kin, weaving her memory into their songs, while the town built its own traditions around her legacy. Each year, during the season of harvest, they gathered together for a shared feast, lighting fires on both sides of the once feared border. White cloths were hung as symbols, not of defiance, but of unity, a reminder of a night when one woman dared to wear what no one else would. Her act had become not just memory, but ritual, binding both peoples to the promise of peace. Her father lived long enough to see the full measure of what she had done. The man who had once carried the weight of poverty now carried the quiet dignity of a legacy that outlived him. In his final days, he told her that her courage had not only changed the tribe and the town, but had redeemed his own name. She had shown the world that worth is never defined by wealth, but by the strength of the heart. When she finally passed, both town and tribe gathered under the wide western sky. They buried her on the border that no longer divided them, her grave marked not by stone, but by a field of white flowers planted by children who had grown into adults carrying her story in their hearts. Her resting place became a sacred ground, not because of wealth or power, but because it was where centuries of hatred had ended. And so the legend of the woman in white endured. Travelers carried it far beyond the plains, telling of how a single act of courage could break chains forged by generations. The West remembered many tales of guns and greed, but this story outlasted them all, for it proved that in the harshest of lands, where prejudice had stood unchallenged for centuries, compassion and courage could still rise, dressed in white, and change everything. The story of the woman in white leaves behind more than memory. It leaves behind a mirror. Her single act, as fragile as it seemed, carried the weight to shake centuries of prejudice. She stepped into the firelight knowing she might be rejected, yet her courage revealed a truth stronger than fear. Borders are not written in the soil, but in the hearts of those who believe in them. And when one heart dares to defy, the ground itself begins to shift. The border that once divided town and tribe became the stage where their shared humanity was finally seen. What began with suspicion ended with cooperation, with grain exchanged for venison, with songs sung in two tongues around the same fire. It was not treaties or battles that carved this change. It was a woman's quiet defiance, a simple dress, and the willingness to face eyes filled with doubt. Her story teaches us that peace does not arrive in thunder. It begins in whispers of courage. Her father's farm, once a symbol of poverty, became sacred ground. The tribe honored it as the birthplace of unity, and the town cherished it as the soil where prejudice was uprooted. Generations later, children still traced her steps in their play, wearing scraps of white cloth as they crossed an invisible line that no longer held them back. She had turned a border into a bridge, and in doing so, gave both peoples a new inheritance, freedom from the weight of hatred. Her legacy reminds us that even in the harshest of lands, where traditions seem unshakable and wounds eternal, one act can tip the balance. The West recorded many tales of violence, but this story endures because it proves that compassion can rewrite what history insists must remain. She did not carry a weapon or a crown, only the courage to walk forward when the world demanded she stay behind. And that courage proved enough to change everything. If her journey moved you, let's spark reflection. Share in the comments how this story speaks to your own life, and what borders, seen or unseen, you believe can be crossed with courage. Subscribe to the channel and like this video so we can continue to share powerful tales from the Old West, stories that do more than entertain. They remind us that one act of bravery can echo across generations.